All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a major government blueprint that's designed to take on one of the biggest financial headaches for so many Americans, the sky-high cost of prescription drugs.
It's a huge question, right? It affects pretty much everyone. And this executive order we're looking at lays out a very specific multi-part strategy to try and answer it. So let's walk through that plan step by step. So, the document at the heart of all this is Executive Order 14273. You can think of it like a master plan, really. It was signed on April 15th, 2025, and it basically tells a whole bunch of government agencies to get moving on one big central goal. Okay, so before we jump into what the plan is, we've got to understand why it exists in the first place. How does this order actually see the problem? Let's dig into the why behind all these new directives. And right off the bat, this quote from the very first section really sets the tone. It's pretty blunt. The core problem, as they define it, is this massive price difference. The fact that Americans are paying way more than people in other countries for the exact same medicine. From there, the order really paints a picture of two different approaches. On one side, it points to things it calls successful first-term actions. Stuff like pushing for generics and capping insulin costs. But on the other hand, it's pretty critical of the Inflation Reduction Act. It claims that law didn't save much money and, interestingly, created something it calls a pill penalty. So what on earth is a pill penalty? Good question. According to this document, it's all about timing. See, under the Inflation Reduction Act, your standard pills got hit with price controls a full 4 years earlier than the more complicated biologic drugs. The argument in this order is that this imbalance actually discourages companies from researching and investing in those everyday, often cheaper medicines. So now that the problem's on the table, the order pivots to the action plan, and the first big target in its sights, the two giants of government healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid. Section 3 gives us this really clear three-step strategy for dealing with the Inflation Reduction Act. First, there's the immediate stuff. Issue new guidance for how Medicare negotiates drug prices and do it in 60 days. Then, the medium-term goal. Come up with ways to lower Part D premiums, and they've got 180 days for that. And the long game? That's working with Congress to get rid of that pill penalty we just talked about. And the focus on these programs doesn't stop there. The order sets the clock ticking on a few other key things, like testing out new ways to pay for super expensive drugs, figuring out what hospitals are actually paying for these medications, and making the Medicaid drug rebate system work better. All right, let's shift gears to the next big part of this plan. This section is all about competition. And the logic is pretty straightforward, right? If you can get more affordable options out on the market, basic economics says the prices should come down. So how do they plan to do that? Well, Section 9 basically gives the FDA a 6-month deadline to figure out two things. First, how to speed up the approval for generics and biosimilars are just what they sound like. They're almost identical copies of those really complex biologic drugs. Second, they want to make it easier to reclassify some prescription drugs so you can just buy them over the counter. Another really interesting piece of this supply puzzle is importation. Section 10 puts officials on a really tight deadline, just 90 days, to smooth out the process for importing cheaper but still approved drugs from other countries. The goal is to make it a whole lot less complicated. Okay, so for the last major piece of the strategy, the spotlight moves away from the drug makers themselves and shines right on that complicated web in the middle, the supply chain and all of its middlemen. And this part calls for a big multi-agency push for more transparency. It wants recommendations on how to fix the entire system from start to finish. It also specifically targets pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, those companies that negotiate drug prices for your insurance plan. The idea is to propose new rules to make their fees way more transparent. And finally, it demands a report on how to crack down on any anti-competitive stuff the drug companies might be doing. And tucked inside the order is another really specific and pretty important directive. This one is aimed right at community health centers. Section 7 says they have to make life-saving drugs, we're talking insulin, epinephrine, available at or even below what they cost, specifically for low-income patients who need them most. Whew! Okay, we have covered a ton of ground here, more than a dozen different directives aimed at multiple agencies. So what does this all look like when you actually put it on a timeline? Well, to put it mildly, it's ambitious. Let's just quickly recap the timeline. In just 60 days, that new Medicare guidance is supposed to drop. At the 90-day mark, we're supposed to see action on importation and those middlemen.
By 6 months, a whole wave of reports on competition and premiums are due. And within a year, they have to pick a new payment model for those really expensive drugs to start testing. It is a really, really fast sequence of deadlines. So when you take a step back and look at the big picture, all of these individual directives, all dozen plus of them, are really pushing toward 4 main goals. The whole point of this executive order is to crank up transparency, inject more competition into the market, overhaul how the government pays for drugs, and at the end of the day, lower the price you pay for your prescriptions. And that, of course, brings us to the big final question. This executive order sets a massive, complex government machine whirring into action with some really tight deadlines and huge goals. But after all the dust settles, after all the reports are filed and the new rules are proposed, what will the real-world impact actually be on your pharmacy bill? That right there is the ultimate test.